David, thanks. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth comes to the Oshkosh Corporation this afternoon to view production capabilities and also speak with workers.
This is part of his Arsenal of Freedom tour as President Trump prepares to ask Congress to boost military spending to its highest level ever. Our chief political reporter Jason Zimmerman there today with the Secretary. He joins us now live in Oshkosh. Jason?
Chris, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth spoke for about half an hour inside a hangar at the Whitman Regional Airport before hundreds of workers from the Oshkosh Corporation and more specifically Oshkosh Defense. His plane then took off around 3 o'clock this afternoon. Hegseth says the president will request $1.5 trillion from Congress to boost military spending that will go towards equipment, some of which is made right here in Wisconsin. He says Oshkosh has made a name for itself in producing high-quality equipment that should be an example for the rest of the country as preparations and spending for future conflicts is considered.
A key piece of legislation passed by this administration and championed by your representatives, the One Big Beautiful Bill, specifically secured $190 million in defense contracts executed right here in Wisconsin. And we intend to do more as we move forward modernizing our forces.
State Democrats releasing a statement on Hegseth's visit, saying in part, quote, Pete Hegseth and Wisconsin Republicans like Tom Tiffany, Derek Van Orden, and Brian Stile are so desperate to do damage control for jacking up the cost of living with their wildly unpopular tariffs and endless war of choice in Iran that they now stoop to parading around Hegseth to sell them on a failed economic agenda, end quote. Also, Congressman Glenn Grothman was at this event. We asked him if he supports the $1.5 trillion in military spending that he could soon vote on. He said that a lot of things need to be looked at and considered before that happens, but he does have concerns about the number of ununiformed workers inside the Department of Defense. He claims that that number needs to be brought back down. Reporting live in Oshkosh, Jason Zimmerman, Action 2 News.